Welcome to Tuesday, I guess. Just waking up my fingers a little bit today. How is everybody out there? I had a bit of savagery there with the trombetta, tornita, and the magic button on my Ronin guitar, which activates a hidden piezo pickup in there. So yesterday I posted about a new PDF. If you're new to my musical world, you may or may not know that I like to draw and I like to create these PDFs that illustrate things that I think about in terms of music or tone, production. It's a way of kind of trying to take some of my philosophical swirl that happens up here, the stuff that I get really focused in on and kind of nerdy about, and get them out into the world and in sort of a format that is better for communication than even me trying to eloquently state what I'm thinking about. So this is the fourth in a series of PDFs that I've, I guess you could say, released. Looks like this. It's going to be backwards, but it's called How I Think About Guitar Amps. And one of the things that I get really interested in is how we talk about and how we examine, the guitar and the amp, which I would posit. You probably heard me say this before. This thing on its own is not an instrument. It needs to be plugged into something that makes it louder in order for us to use it for musical purposes. So the instrument really is the guitar and the amp together. So I like to examine how we think about the guitar, how we think about the amp, how we think about how those things interact with the space that we're in. And my latest PDF is How I Think About Guitar Amps. It looks a little bit like this. So I kind of broke it into four main characteristics that I look at when I'm playing through an amp, what I think about when I'm playing through an amp. And I think it's kind of a good starter place if you're examining a new amp. Maybe you're thinking, sorry, we got a little interrupted there. Hey there. Maybe you're thinking about buying a new amp. Maybe you're checking out a backline amp, or you're borrowing an amp for a gig. I think there's sort of four main criteria that I look at when I am examining a new amp. And the first one is a bit broad, but I think it's kind of necessary and good, which is I like to just, what's like a snapshot of the overall character of this imaginary amp that you're checking out? Is it a black face Fender? Classically, they tend to be kind of scooped in the mids, and they have a lot of high end. They have a good deal of low end. Depending on the model, they can get kind of farty in the low end, so you sort of have to watch that. But they sort of have that sparklier, brighter, steelier sort of sound, So the overall character of that amp might be that it is bright, that it is a little steely. My friend John from Ronin Guitars has a beautiful little Gibson amp. I think it's a BR6, and the cabinet is actually made out of old redwood, and it is a really rich and dark sounding amp. It's kind of focused as well. It's not a ton of high end, not a ton of low end. So thinking about it in terms of what is the overall character of the amp that you're playing through. Snapshot, first impression. The second thing that I think about is what I call the torque or the speed of the amp. And I didn't really have a category for this in my brain until many years ago. I sort of bought my first really nice boutique small company amp, and it was divided by 13 JR 915, and I was just the combination of the way that amp is designed and the speaker that was in the cabinet that it came with. I had never played an amp that was that fast, that responded. I just felt like, wow, this thing really jumps up and barks. It has this incredible amount of torque. It goes from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. Because every other amp that I had had previous to then was a lot slower. I had no idea, but that's kind of when I first started thinking about it. So how responsive is it? How fast does it jump up? The third thing that I think about is what I call resilience. And this is kind of the other end of, kind of on the other end of the note. Like, how quickly does the amp go back to silence? And I think that this part has a lot to do with speaker cabinet design. Some cabinets are designed to be very, very tight and almost acoustically dead. They go silent almost immediately. This would be like considered tight sounding cabinets. And some are designed more to be a part of the acoustic character of the sound. They're meant to resonate, especially if you look at a lot of the old Fender designs. Those cabinets are pretty resonant, and it's part of the sort of loose characteristic of those amps. So what is the resilience of the amp? Once you activate it, how quickly does it come back to stillness? And then the fourth category that I think about is what I call radiance. And this has to do with how focused the beam of high end is that's shooting out of the front of the amp. Some amps have this very tiny little super focused beam of high end where if your ear isn't in that place, you don't hear all the high end that's happening. So if the amp is sitting on the floor, perhaps it's all like all the high ends hitting your calf muscles, and you might be turning it up way brighter than you need to, for the venue. Maybe if the worst is if it's all shooting past you, but the stage is high enough that people are like head height where your amp is, they could be getting like a severe ice pick in the ear kind of effect from your amp. So some amps have a much wider spread. I have a custom Benson 212 cab that Chris made for me that actually the baffle is not. I said, hey, can you do like a V front cab or something, or maybe a cab where the baffle tilts back a little bit so that the sound is dispersed more on a stage, especially in venues where you're relying more on the sound of your amp rather than monitoring to hear yourself. Could you do like one of those two things and maybe make a cabinet that has more dispersal, so I can kind of more of the sound gets thrown around and I can hear more accurately than with my 112? And he said, sure. And he made one that the baffles for the 212 is actually V front and slightly tilted back. So geometrically, it's pretty awesome looking. But so the speakers are actually pointed up a little bit and pointed out. So that cab sounds awesome, and there's a great radiance that it has compared to my 112 cab, which is really focused sounding. So those are kind of the four things that I think about when I think about amps. It's kind of like the surface level. What's the overall character? What's the torque? How fast does it respond? How resilient is it? Does it go back to silence really quickly, or is there additional resonance built into it? And radiance, like how much spread does it have? And I think that's sort of like a great crash course way of kind of determining the overall vibe and sound of an amp that you're trying to evaluate. And there's no right or wrong answer in any of those four categories. My main amp, my Benson Chimera, is very fast, so it feels very responsive and sensitive to all the things that I'm doing. With the cabinet design that Chris uses in the amp overall, it's not overly tight, not like a, I don't know, like a Fryette or something like that, where they're built to be very, some of the models especially are built to be very tight. The resilience it's kind of loose, which I like. I like that kind of organic thing. And with my 212 cab, the Radiance is really wide. The spread of the sound is very big. And I would say that the overall character of it is very broad and toothy and kind of muscular sounding. So you could compare that to, say, like a Fender Deluxe or something, like a Tweed Deluxe, which, I don't think those are particularly fast. I think that they have kind of an overall kind of a warmer, throatier sound that gets into the raspy zone depending on kind of the condition of the speaker when you crank it. They're not particularly resilient. They sort of have like a pudding feel to them. They're not hard. They're very like squishy and soft. And each one's a little different, but I would say that the Radiance, they're pretty focused coming out the front of the cabinet. So you don't even have to necessarily adopt these same categories, but I think it's very valuable to put the conversation out there into the world, that we can kind of work on getting some collective language around how we think about amps. And maybe, I know for a long time I didn't examine or think about it, and maybe you never have either. Like, what is it that my amp is bringing to this party, this tone party that I have with my fingers and guitar, and are there things about that I love? Are there things about that I want to change? So that's the current PDF. Here's a real world copy of it. It's got my drawing of my Benson amp on there, and you can find this if you go to my profile. The link is in the bio to download this so that you can study it, think about it, decide what you agree with, what you disagree with, print it out, hang it up on your wall, frame it, anything you want to do with it. And this is all sort of part of my greater quest to be a help to guitarists specifically, but musicians in general, to get more in touch with the sound that they're creating on the instrument, both for their enjoyment and also just to increase their musical expression, to have more of a connection to the notes they're playing and the sound that they're making. Anybody have any questions about that? Any thoughts? Disagree? What's your favorite amp? The other thing about kind of creating some categories for evaluating amps is that they're not all the same. They have different characteristics. And it's great. The point is not to try to normalize amps to the thing that only works for you. The other thing is, like, what does this amp do well? And then how can I, as a player, lean into that sound and kind of capitalize on it, or make the most of whatever the idiosyncrasies of this particular device are. You know, because you might be sitting in or whatever, or you just have a couple different amps in your house. I mean, my buddy Skull Servant here, I know that he's got 2 different favorite amps that he was talking about on the thread from this PDF. And they're pretty different, but they do different things. So even just being able to really quickly assess, like, what's great about this amp and how can I begin to lean into that with my playing is a really powerful skill to have. Speaking of, Skull Servant says, old Sun cabs do some of the weird speaker angles for projection too. I haven't messed with the old Sun stuff, but yeah, I think back in the day, in the 50s and early 60s, there were a ton of really fascinating speaker cab designs, and people had all kinds of really batty concepts about what they were doing, whether it was V front or, you know, there are some amps that I've seen that are like V front, and then they have like speakers on the side that shoot out to the side, or you find amps that have 10-inch speakers, and then they have 6-inch tweeters, and people messed around with a whole bunch of really fascinating stuff. I mean, the other thing was that a lot of amps were made to be kind of multi-purpose. That's why there's a mic input on a lot of old Fenders. A lot of amps were made to amplify accordions or to function as small PA systems. So there used to be a whole lot of really fascinating, quirky designs. Now, you know, tube amps being a fairly robust and developed technology, like a lot of the designs have become canonized, just in terms of, like, you think of an amp, you know, Fender, Vox, and Marshall are kind of the like main 3 I would posit. So when new people design amps, they kind of stay in similar realms as those, because that's what we've come to think of as amplifiers. But there used to be a lot of really funky, weird designs, I've seen some cool stuff where you'd have an amp that was designed to just be a reverb. It's like a reverb tank, but it actually feeds off of the speaker out of another amp, and it has its own tank and its own speaker in a separate cab, which is a really cool idea. Like, just having a cab dedicated to your spring reverb is a really cool idea. So, ultimately the most useful designs win out and propagate, and really that's also based on, you know, the players that made the most history were playing Fenders and Voxes and Marshalls, so those became kind of the go-to things, which is logical but also a little sad. It'd be fun if somebody out there was doing some super wacky, really interesting stuff. I mean, not unlike the V-front tilt-back cab that I have from Benson. You know, it's pretty unusual, but it does a great thing, and I wish that more people were experimenting with that kind of stuff. You know, I have played a Science amp. Skull Servant says, check out Science amps. Oh, that's cool. An amp with 2 reverb tanks. That's a cool idea. One of the other really cool things that I saw not too long ago, Comet amps, Comet with a K, they designed this thing called an ambicab, which the Ambicab is like a normal guitar cabinet that also has a Class D power amp in it that powers. I think it was like a 112 for the main guitar and then two 10s for powering basically like a dry wet setup. So you could have your main guitar thing happening and then send a signal out through a reverb and bring that into the same cab. It was actually pretty effective and pretty cool to have that set up in a single cab. I essentially do the same thing in a really unwieldy way because I have my cab and I have two powered speakers that amplify my laptop looping and sonic manipulations. But that was one of the more original things that I've seen in a long time. Hey, Dree. Dree, the brilliant artist. I got to come back to your gallery sometime. We got to do something else live together. Sammy says, Super Black Magic Reverb amp is stellar. I spent about 3 hours at the Chicago Music Exchange in a sound booth and A/B tested 5 Supro amps against all the most common Fenders, Marshalls. That's cool. Yeah, I dig the Supro thing. You know, I think also the modern Fenders, there's great amps to be found there for sure. I don't know who makes the Supro stuff now, but I have to assume that it's a smaller company. A lot of it is just people who will go to the lengths to hand wire stuff. I know there's like a lot of insanity and argument on the internet around circuit board versus hand wired, and you know, it's just, I think it's about volume sometimes. How many amps does a company make? How many amps does Fender make in a year versus a company like Supro? Or then you start getting smaller and smaller like Benson or that Science company. And some of it's that, and then some of it I think is just, it's really refreshing to hear something different from the most, like the three most common sounds, you know, like there's how many people have played through a variation of a Tweed Deluxe or a Princeton Reverb, how many people have played through an AC30, how many people have played through a Marshall JMP 50 or a Super Lead. Those are amazing sounds, but they have so much historical weight to them. Sometimes it's nice to just plug into like a cool Supro or something that you don't even know, a completely different design, and you know, sort of be freed from the bonds of those historical sounds. You know, sort of like Telecasters are awesome, and there's a bazillion great players who have canonized that instrument, but it also comes with its own baggage. And or maybe I'm just not that great of a musician, but sometimes I hear certain sounds and it's just like, oh, it calls for this thing. Sammy says the reverb tank on the Supro is definitely different and stood out, but I still prefer the Fender Spring sound, but still went with the Supro. Yeah, I hear you, man. So did you get the Black Magic? Is that what you picked up? lot about the psychology around sound, and just you play an instrument, and for me, it could be anything. It could be a guitar setup, it could be a bass, it could be a drum set, and how certain sounds, they're almost like presets that come preloaded with ideas, things that you're gonna kind of go to licks or go to vibes. In the drum world, it would be like it could be anything. It could be like a Gretsch kit with calfskin heads on it. It could be an old Ludwig kit with tea towels on the toms and snare, and it's like these are going to define your vocabulary on the instrument. Not that you can't kind of completely eschew that, the sort of predefined things, but they come loaded with that kind of stuff. A Strat into a super lead Marshall is like hard not to go to Hendrix world if you could turn it up loud enough to be allowed to do that. Those amps that have so much, those amps and guitars and pieces of gear that have so much history of the people who came before. I mean, you could get on a kit, you could get on a drum set that's got the tea towels on everything and try to play like John Bonham. But, maybe you should. It would be interesting. Sammy says, my other go-to amp is a 20th anniversary Hughes and Kettner tube amp, small 21 amp, but it's closed back and really has a beefy tone. Thoughts on closed back amp versus open? Well, I have played both, and in general, I prefer open back amps. I like, for lack of a better term, I like this sort of more organic and airy thing. Definitely being in the room with an amp, playing on a smaller stage or recording in the room with an amp. An open back cab, I feel like it has a little more radiance. It has a little more kind of a loose thing going on, and I like that a lot. I think it's kind of a more three-dimensional feeling thing. That being said, if you want something that's really robust and has a lot of tight low end, I think the closed back cab is the way to go. I don't have a closed back cab right now, but I sort of wish that I'd like to get one in the near future. I have kind of a concept in mind for something I'd like to get built, but just to have the option. I think they're both really valid, and I really prefer open back amps. Hey Sebastian, nice to see you on here. Yeah, in general, I prefer the sound of open back cabs, just for that slightly looser, more radiant thing that they do. But if you want to really hesh out, you got to get the closed back thing going. I think it's just a tighter sound and feel. So yeah, that's my opinion on that. Sebastian, who is a killer producer and engineer, poses the question, what do you think about the Kemper? I have spent little time with the Kemper. I have messed with the kind of main competitor of that, which is the Axe Effects, and I think that the digital modeling technology has gotten good enough that for some people it makes playing a real tube amp impractical, especially if you're flying, and that in the context of a recording, meaning like by the time you've mixed and EQ'd and placed everything in a recording, that no, we've long ago surpassed the time where you could tell a difference between that stuff. Like, no one's gonna know that it's not a real amp that wasn't mic'd. That's my opinion on that stuff. I think that it makes me. So I think it's actually probably a really great tool. I record direct. I'm actually playing direct right now through a little Fryette Valvulator GPDI, which is like a 1 watt amp that has a direct out and a really great analog cab emulation section on it, and that totally works well for me for recording sounds when I don't want to be really loud. But I would totally use a Kemper in my home studio. I sort of lament the loss of. This makes me sound like an old person, but like people having the experience of playing through an amp that's cranked up loud, and the guitar evolves. It sort of elevates or levitates into this other instrument, where you actually have mechanical feedback and resonance. If the amp's loud enough and the sound pressure is high enough in the room to actually resonate the wood, and you get that connection going on, it just becomes a different thing. And I personally like some of the inconsistencies and variety and unpredictability that comes from using an actual tube amp, because it's going to sound different in every room, wherever it sits in the room, all that kind of stuff. But I love that. I like plugging into something and feeling a physical connection to it and being surprised. And I think that there are very few surprises associated with digital modeling, because it is about delivering a consistency, I think. So it's all cool. There's a place for every tool. And if I was on a big like a live show right now, if I were doing a tour or something and everything was in in-ear monitors and there probably wouldn't be any cabs allowed on stage, I'd probably be playing through a Kemper or a Line 6 Helix or something like that, because it would just be so consistent. So that's my thoughts about it. What do you think, man? I'm sure you've recorded both a ton. Sebastian says he just recorded one. How did you feel? He says, meh. Yeah, man. I think too, because you're an engineer, right? And like mic choice, mic placement, compression, EQ. I mean, combining multiple microphones. Like these are all part of the fun. And then you create new sounds. I think it takes a different. It's a different kind of thing to create a new sound out of a preset. So, yeah. He says he missed the three-dimensional part. It was very two-dimensional. Yeah, I think that's part of it. I find that I end up working a lot harder to create the sense of dimension when I'm recording direct. Reverbs, delays, and I feel like with real amps that are recorded, even if they're mono, there's a more sense of a left to right dimension to them that happens as opposed to recording direct. I don't know why that would be. That's just my feeling about it. Yeah, they do sit differently in the track. You're totally right about that. also, I mean, I feel this way in general about digital emulations of analog things, but part of what is exciting to me about analog gear, be it an amp or a mic preamp or a compressor, is I feel as though the standard operating range of a piece of gear like that is easier to model accurately than the extremes are. So you might get, a model that of a 1073 or a Fender Deluxe or something like that, that sounds really accurate to an original in sort of a normal range, but when you start pushing things, which is what I think is really fun to do, out of the comfort zone, it's hard to model the irregularities and the idiosyncrasies of that stuff, how a tube compressor behaves when you're slamming it. So I think that's the other thing. It's really fun to, plug into a Fender Deluxe and blow it up with some kind of crazy treble booster on the front end, and like that's just hard to emulate, I think. Sammy says, how often do I look for new guitars and new tools for making music? I'm just at the early stages of partnering with a builder to start our own line of guitars, being hand-built in Michigan. Would love to get something in your hands when we get moving. Oh man, I love to experiment with new things all the time. So I would say that financially and responsibly, I don't buy as many guitars, amps, and pedals as I wish that I did anymore. I've also found some things that really, really work for me, and it's been kind of fun to focus on what do I get out of this slightly smaller recipe of things. But man, I would be playing with new stuff every day just for the experience and inspiration of it. So, you know how to get in touch with me. I'd love to check out some new stuff and give feedback and whatnot. Which that's cool that you're working with a guitar builder. I want to know more about that. Another great thing is having friendships at a good guitar store that you can go to and just go try a bunch of stuff out. I'm pretty good friends with the guys and girls down at Emerald City Guitars in Seattle, and if I have some time, I'll pop in to say hi to them, and they don't ever seem to get upset when I play guitars for an hour and just kind of check out stuff that's in the shop. So that also scratches the itch for me. Right now, I'm definitely way more excited about pedals than I am about guitars and amps, but always curious. So, yeah. Cool. I'm going to look that up. Very much going to look that up. Well, everybody, it is about time for me to go get into some other trouble. But, man, I really enjoyed the discussion today. That was fun. And just as a reminder, this beauty, which you will see backwards right now, next time I'm going to print this backwards so that it shows up the other way. My PDF, which kind of lays out a few ways that I think about guitar amps, which might be helpful to anybody who wants to dive deeper into that subject, is available if you go to the link in my bio. I'd love to hear what you think about it. Let me know. It's a thing that I hand drew, and it's kind of something I'm into doing. And by all means, DM me. Feel free to email me, hello@danphelps.com, and let's just keep the conversation going. So, thank you all. Bye.